everybody. Welcome to Your Money Map, sponsored by the Alliance for Lifetime Income. I'm your host, Jean Chatzky. Very glad to have you along with me today. So, about a week or so ago, I picked up my Wall Street Journal, as I do most days. Actually, truthfully, I read it online most of the time these days. And there was this very interesting article about people who are hiring retirement coaches, people not to help them strategize to save enough to get them to retirement, not people who are hiring investment advisors to help them make their money last, which is definitely something that you want to think about if you haven't thought about it already, but actual coaches who will help them figure out how to live their lives in retirement, how to spend their days, where they want to live, figuring out how to come out of your working life and establish a new rhythm, a new identity, a new way of going about things. And where you live is a very, very big part of that decision. We're going to focus in on that today. Home sweet home in retirement. We're going to do it with Dr. Rodney Harrell. He is a return guest on this show. He is the vice president of Family, Home, and Community with AARP. And in that job, he takes the lead on housing issues. He directs AARP's Public Policy Institute's team of experts on long-term services and supports, family caregiving, livable communities, a whole bunch of really interesting topics that are changing around us as we speak. And so I'm excited to dive into this with him again today and to dive into it with any of you who are along watching. If you have questions, as always, we invite you to participate. Put those questions in the chat and we will pull them right into the conversation. So let me bring in Rodney Harrell and say hello. Hey, Rodney.
Hello, Jean. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you so much for being here. So it's been a little bit over a year since we had you on the show. It was actually one of our most watched shows. We got a big response to it because I think when it comes to the question of where am I going to live in retirement, how am I going to find a dwelling that is comfortable for me, not just in my 60s and 70s, but in my 80s and 90s and beyond, the world is changing very quickly. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing in the landscape these days.
Well, I think it's an important point for a lot of reasons. One thing that hasn't changed is that housing is certainly the most important part of budgets. It's the biggest part of most people's budget at all income levels. And so housing continues to be one of those important issues for folks. And in this time since COVID, I think many people have been reassessing whether their housing meets their needs. I mean, we've seen a lot of folks reacting to the tragedy in our nation's nursing homes by thinking about, well, does my housing meet my needs? What would happen to me if I were to be in a situation where I'd had no housing choice? And so one of the silver linings of that tragedy is that I think it's got more people thinking ahead about their housing needs, which is certainly a big challenge.
I know for many years, whenever you did a survey at AARP or other surveys were done, and people were asked, where do you want to live in retirement? The resounding answer was exactly where I'm living right now. I don't want to move. I want to age in place. Has that changed, or is that still the case for most people?
And you're right, we ask that all the time, and it's still 8 out of 10 of those 50 and older, roughly, that say that. And so we see that as a long-term, enduring trend of folks. They want to be where they are. And the question is, are they in a neighborhood? Are they in a home that allows them to do that and do that well? That's one of the key things that kind of is outside that question is, do we have the housing options that allow us to do that and do that in a way that gives us the freedom, the choices, the opportunities to do what we want? Because for most people, the choice seems to be either my neighborhood where I am now or giving that up for some scary unknown.
And there are a lot of in betweens. There are other places to live within the community that you might be in today. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I actually want to explore the question of what is livable as we age. You all did a survey that took a look at that and really dug into the important things that people need as we get older so that life just doesn't become too difficult. What did you find?
Well, to pull it all down into one word, I'd say options.
Hmm.
Options are important for folks. And so we found that neighborhoods that have things like transportation options, the ability to get around by walking to things that you might need, by being able to access public transportation or other forms of transportation, were important, particularly for those who don't drive. Uh, and frankly, we might not anticipate the fact that we might not be able to drive one day.
Yeah.
So if we've got that option there, we may be able to tap into it, even if we don't use it today now. So that transportation option was one piece, and I hinted at the fact that people want to be near certain things like parks and libraries and grocery stores, things that make it feel like a community as well. And frankly, another one of those things that ties around to the question today is, are you in a neighborhood that has other options for housing? So over 80% of the country is just single family homes, all of those neighborhoods. And so if you want to downsize, if you can no longer walk upstairs, if you want to be able to stay in the neighborhood, keep your social connections, the places you like to visit, your friends, etc., it's good to have a neighborhood that has options in case your current housing option doesn't work for you anymore.
Yeah, I'm looking out my window while I'm talking to you. During the pandemic, my husband and I, we relocated to Philadelphia. So we moved from a suburb where I would get into my car 3, 4 times a day to go out and do different things, whether I was meeting a friend for dinner or whether I was running to the grocery store or whether I was taking my dog to the vet. Today, I get in the elevator. I walk out my building. There's a grocery store around the corner. The vet is 3 blocks away. If I want to meet a friend for dinner, I have an option literally right across the street. I mean, it seems to me that cities are fabulous places for people to think about aging in place. Are you seeing any sort of a move toward cities? I mean, I know during the pandemic, there were people who wanted more space than cities allowed.
That's true. And there's multiple trends going on at the same time. I mean, if you look at the global trends, there are long-term global trends towards urbanization, more people being in cities. And I mean, even in this country, if we think about the 1700s, where most people lived on a farm somewhere. Uh, but by and large, while some of those movements are happening, we're still a country of suburbs for the most part. So many Americans do live in suburbs, but those suburbs can vary from almost city-like to almost farm-like and everywhere in between too. So those places that really have some of the things that we're talking about, the connectivity, the walkability, the elements that really make places have those options I was talking about earlier, those are enduringly popular places. But the trends are a little harder to tease out because so many suburbs are kind of in that middle ground. And that's where a lot of people live.
The other the other big event that coincided with this pandemic, perhaps brought on in part by this pandemic, is the rise of housing costs and the fact that we are now more than ever clued into the fact that we've got a housing crisis in this country. I mean, part of the reason that prices went up so fast, besides the fact that millennials were looking for homes for their growing families, besides the fact that people wanted more space, was just the fact that we don't have enough housing stock. Can you talk about the different initiatives that are underway to try to deal with this crisis?
It's a huge one. And frankly, it's a long-term trend. I've said that we've been in a housing affordability crisis for over a decade plus now. And, you know, the one thing about the pandemic, aside from talking to us about how our housing fits our needs, is that we also try to think about that from an affordability standpoint. We saw so many people hit by the economic impact of the pandemic, not just the health impact. And so it definitely drove this more into the public consciousness and the news and everything else. And I think so that's a good thing in the sense that it's drawn awareness to a challenge. And so we've seen more enthusiasm for some of the policy changes and other things that can create more of those housing options. So not just options to meet our physical needs, but options that we can afford. And so one thing that we've been particularly excited about is the idea of accessory dwelling units and how using your own property to create a second unit, an in-law suite or a guest house or cottage, can not only give you that flexibility we're talking about with design, and maybe you should live in it, maybe you could live in it, maybe a caregiver could, that kind of a thing. The person who might otherwise end up in a nursing home might be able to have an option there, but also it brings in affordability into existing neighborhoods. And so the idea that this unit might be more affordable than a single family home. And we've seen this at the same time as people have been talking about things like what's sometimes called missing middle housing, from the idea that we're not building as many duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes that we used to years ago. And that type of housing is missing. It's the missing middle housing between a single family home and a high rise. And so, I went to the American Planning Association conference a few months ago, and the biggest thing there, people were out the door to talk about zoning reform, the idea that communities are really working to make it easier to build a range of things to really respond to this need you're talking about.
That actually was my next question, and we're getting some comments from some folks who are listening. Mary says that affordable housing is actually what is needed in most states. Kathy is retired. She's a lifelong New York City suburb resident, and she said, yes, it's expensive, but we can afford it, and Florida is too hot, too humid, and friends complain about healthcare. That said, retirees must take a critical look at their finances. Her retiree location that she's wishing for is Hawaii, hands down. Kathy, I was just there. I agree with you. I think Hawaii would be an amazing place to retire. But again, you pick up the newspapers, Rodney, and there are a lot of stories about NIMBYism, about this idea of, sure, you want to build affordable housing units, you want to build accessory dwelling units, not in my backyard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are these zoning laws starting to change with enough force and speed to actually make a difference?
Now, that's a great question. And the short answer is, unfortunately, no, or not yet. I'll say I'll be positive about it, because I know AARP and other organizations are working to try to make things easier and make things better. I mean, we've put out a model act on accessory dwelling units, for example, and others that really help communities make these changes. But we're also talking to folks about how these things might benefit them. And one of the keys, and I see Mary's point about affordable housing as being what's needed. She's absolutely right. Not just most states, but most communities, that we just simply don't have enough affordable housing, not enough subsidized housing, not enough housing at different price points in most communities of this country. And so what we need to do is to be able to build that. So those options are there. And so the NIMBYism, I think, is one of the bigger challenges to fight here. And the idea to me is that one thing I found in all of our surveying is that people don't necessarily think ahead, that they don't necessarily think about things that don't impact them today. But the idea that maybe you're fine now, but what would happen to you if your spouse passed or if your income drops? Could you stay in the same neighborhood? Could you still go to your favorite restaurant or religious institution or whatever it might be if you can no longer afford that rent or that mortgage payment? I mean, that's a big question for most of us. And hopefully by educating people and making them think about how it's not just about those people, whoever that is, but it's also about your neighbors, yourself, other people in the community that might need an option in your neighborhood or community. And so it's all of those things. We want everybody to be able to have choices. And so it's a crucial point, and I think it's one that, to your question, is getting better, that more people are thinking about it. It's more in the news now. But to Mary's point, there's much more to be done here.
Well, and it's not just the financial considerations, it's the physical considerations. I think I told you a story, but if I didn't, I'll tell it to you now about we are fortunate enough that we have a house at the shore, and like many houses at the shore, it's built upside down because that's the way you get the best views of the water, the bay, whatever it is you're looking at. And so because it's upside down, there are a lot of stairs, right? My mother, we lost my stepfather earlier this year, has been spending a lot of time there with us. She's in her 80s. She is in great shape. She can handle the stairs, but I'm thinking ahead that maybe in a couple of years she might not be able to. And so we're actually looking at, is it possible to put in an elevator at not such a great cost? And that's something that I never would have thought that we would consider. But you have to look at your physical dwelling as well and think about, is this place going to be okay for me if all of a sudden my knees are not what they used to be?
And that's absolutely right. We all need to make that kind of calculation, and not just me, my spouse, my other family members, whoever it might be that's using my home. Can they access the things in and out of my home that they want to? And I often give the example of my own parents who put in a zero-step entrance and some other things into their home so that my grandmothers could potentially get there and perhaps even stay there if they needed to. And then eventually my father ended up having a stroke. That was clearly not planned or expected. But now he could get in and out and around the house because those features were there. And that kind of thinking ahead is kind of thinking we should all be doing. What could all of our family members use in our home, including me, in the future to get around there?
We've got a viewer on LinkedIn who says, we don't have to live in Hawaii to have great weather. We could move to, I'm going to botch the pronunciation of this city, but I think it's Antalya, Turkey. It's affordable. Your house will be like a resort. Healthcare is better and cheaper. Great options if you're brave and you want to try the expat lifestyle. Sounds good to me. I love Turkish food, by the way. So that would be fun. When we're looking at things like livability, I know that you have a relationship at AARP with the National Association of Realtors, and you have created something that you call a livability index. Can you talk about what that is and what goes into it, and how we can, as people who are thinking about either moving at some point or reformatting our current homes, should be thinking about these decisions to make our homes as livable as possible for as long as possible?
Right. And so it's, again, an important thing as we've been talking about for the last few minutes. And so we created this livability index back in 2015. And what it is, it was the world's first neighborhood-based nationwide livability index. And so every neighborhood in the country is in this index. You can type in an address and get a score back. And that score is a combination of 7 different category scores, which you can also see things like housing or transportation or proximity to different things, or the healthcare, and just many other things are in there. And the idea is that we wanted to give people more information than they could otherwise have. And information is really power here. The idea that the more we know, the more we can be aware of, the better decisions we can make. And not just on where to move, but I'll say there's also the ability to change and improve your own neighborhood. We talked about the NIMBYs earlier. So when we give you these, we actually have 61 different factors in this index. And you can look at just the overall score, but you can dive into those indicators and understand what's going on in our community, what's going on in the community, that across town or across the country, and where could we improve. And that's one of those things for the community. But as an individual, it's about what trade-offs am I making? What kind of options do we have or not have here? We measure whether or not there's affordable housing, as one of our viewers mentioned earlier. We mentioned whether there's zero-step entrances in housing, as you just talked about. We mentioned proximity to parks and libraries and grocery stores, just many of the things that you might think about there. And so I'm very excited that we've started this relationship with the National Association of Realtors. And and basically the story is that when you talk to a realtor and they give you a printout of a home, they'll tell you things about the home and things about the surrounding area. And now, as part of that, is the livability score. It's part of what they call the realtor's property resource. And so when they print out those reports, you can get a hint of this information, and you go to our AARP website and dive in deeper to find even more about the neighborhood and the kind of trade-offs you might be making both now and into the future.
It's so interesting. I remember going through a very similar process when I was searching for a home to raise my kids in. Basically, when you're looking for a home in your 30s and you have young children, you're all about the schools, maybe all about the parks. As you get older and um, as you think about retiring someplace and aging in place someplace, it becomes more about medical care, more about culture, more about the neighborhood, more about other services that you may or may not have access to. Mary is writing that she's with her father. He's 95. She's had to make some updates to her home for his safety. And she's currently with him at his house in Florida, where she is working to make his house more senior safe. I know that you AARP, have embarked upon a partnership with Lowe's where you're educating people about products and tools that they can use to make their homes a little safer. Can you talk about that?
That's right. And it's called Lowe's Livable Home. And the idea is that, again, we should be able to make the changes to our homes that work for us, not just today, but into tomorrow. And one key piece of that is that whether you're dealing with your father's issues now or not, many people are dealing with some of these changes after an emergency, after there's been a fall or something urgent has happened and they've got to make these changes. And we want to help those folks. But we also want to help people who haven't had that happen yet to think ahead about some of the things they might need, because that way you can plan better. It's easier, maybe cheaper as well, to start thinking about these changes before you might need them. That's really the holy grail there.
So let's go through that process. If we're thinking about how individuals should think about how and where they will live during their retirement, what's the process that you go through? What's the very first step?
So to me, there's two pieces to that question. One's the location and one's the house itself. So when I'm starting to think about the location, I'll use the AARP Livability Index or other resources to think about what's in that neighborhood. What are the things that can provide me with what I want and that could also provide me with what I need if something were to shift or change. Again, if my income were to drop, if my physical abilities were to change, if my ability to drive were to change, what kind of neighborhood would work for me for all of those things? And so that's part of why we have that index and that great work there. But then the house itself. So when I'm choosing a home for myself, I would think about, the same kinds of questions. What if my mobility were to change? What if I wanted my parents or children or whoever else to visit? Could this house accommodate them? And if my needs are to change, will the house kind of grow with me? Is there a space on the bottom floor that could be used as a bedroom, for example? Maybe I don't want to use it today, but it's there. If I think I might need an elevator later, maybe the home has those stacked closets that could be turned into an elevator shaft at some later point. Those kind of thoughts are really great to have, even if you don't need those things today. And so one of the things that we create is called the AARP Home Fit Guide. Right? And the idea there is, does your home fit you and what might need? And you can use that or some of the other things out there to try to just check your house room by room, understand what's there and what challenges there might be. There may be big, expensive things like these elevators that we're talking about. There could be smaller things like a home that just has rugs that need to be removed, or there may be clutter, or the way we arrange furniture to just be safer in a home too. So there's kind of from small to fundamental changes. There's lots of things we can do to make sure that the home works for us. So it all boils down to using information that's out there to understand what's there for you today and how that impacts you tomorrow. And AARP has worked hard to provide things for folks in that space. And then there's other information out there as well.
My stepbrother Gary is a doctor, and he routinely goes through houses and he just picks up the throw rugs because he says those are just an accident waiting to happen. You don't want throw rugs that are going to trip you and cause an unnecessary fall.
That's right.
Another thing that happens to people later in life is that they realize they've got more house than they actually need. Are you seeing a rise in home sharing? I mean, my friends joke that as we get older, and as demographics indicate, will likely outlive our spouses, we will just move in together. We'll be the golden girls. I have a good friend from college who already has a claim on my second bedroom. So, is that happening more and more, or is that just a TV show?
Well, the economist part of my brain loves that idea because you think about the fact we talked about there not being enough housing in this country to begin with. And you think about the fact that, well, in some of those existing homes, we've got bedrooms that are not used and space that could be shared and used. And so it's a great concept from that vantage point. But many of us have, the mental block around doing that as well. There's the home as castle kind of a thing, and the fight for independence that many of us have, or instinct to fight for independence, I should say. And so I think those are things that might be internal roadblocks to why we might not see more of that. Uh, the other thing is they're fundamental things like how we get along with a roommate. Will I be safe? Those kind of things. And so room sharing agreements and the like are out there, and the way that we can just make this easier for folks to do. And so to answer your question, we've been seeing some more of this, but not in a sharply increasing way. The numbers are kind of growing of people who are doing this, as frankly, there's more older adults out there. There's more people in need of different arrangements. And so it's something I'm very positive on. And frankly, tying this back to the conversation earlier about zoning, we also need to have the laws in place that allow us to do the things we need to. Maybe building that accessory dwelling unit is a way to have shared housing on my property that could bring in a roommate or someone else. Or maybe it's co-housing is one form of building dedicated housing for sharing, with shared kitchens or common spaces and individual bedrooms for folks. We need the flexibility in the laws to allow people to do it. And frankly, we as homeowners, as community residents, as people that care about our communities, we need to be pushing our community leaders to have more options for us.
When you talk about accessory dwelling units, can you just be a little bit more explicit in what these are? I mean, I think maybe some people have seen them. It's being built in your backyard or on a side yard on a property, but they're fairly new.
Well, it could be known by many names. And at its basic form, it's the idea of building an additional unit. It could be attached, be it an English basement, uh, and many other forms of extra bedrooms attached to your home, or it can be detached above the garage apartment, a carriage house in some states. In Hawaii, they call them ohanas. We have a Hawaii person here, casitas in the West Coast. But the idea that we're adding extra housing to the property, to an existing single family property, is the basic idea here. In-law suites, guest houses. I mean, we could go for hours on the type of names here, but the many different types of names of this option really, to me, makes clear how beneficial it is, because it's used in so many different places, so many different communities in ways that work both for that community and for the family or families that are using that property. And so, again, it's really, to me, it's accessory dwelling unit is a planning term that's, to me, unlocks the door to have just a wide range of flexibility with how we use our property to make more housing options for ourselves and others.
The economist part of your brain likes the fact that we are making more housing available to more people on the same amount of land. The personal finance part of my brain likes the fact that you can take a home that maybe you've owned for years and use it to become an additional source of revenue that can help you make your money last during your retirement.
Absolutely. We see folks renting out the apartments, or perhaps if your house has too many stairs and you build one of these ADUs with universal design features, maybe you live there and you rent out the main house. It's too big for you now. Just that flexibility is just such a wonderful thing for all those reasons.
Another term I want you to dig into when you talk about universal design, what is that?
So universal design is a concept around creating things for people of all abilities. It's different from some other terms that you might have heard about, accessible design, et cetera, that are things that are made specifically for someone who may need wheelchair access or has some physical disability. But the idea of universal design is that from the start, we might build that unit with a zero-step entrance, not a tacked-on ramp with handrails, perhaps. Maybe you need to do that if you've got too many stairs already. But start from the beginning with a clean sheet of paper about how we can create that entrance into the home, or space to navigate within the home that's not narrow doorways, or switches that can be used regardless of your amount of strength, and door handles that are levers. Just many different features that you can, and your home fit guide and other places you can look for more of these tips. But the idea is that we want to make our homes usable for ourselves and others, regardless of what our physical condition is. And the more we think with that mindset, that idea of not just where I am today, but where I might be or my family might be tomorrow, that's the bottom line of the concept and the idea that we should be thinking about with that big picture.
So I'm laughing when you talk about doors with levers, because I'm living, as I mentioned, in Philadelphia in an apartment that we renovated over the last couple of years. We built with as many of those principles in mind as we could. And so we have light switches at a lower level in case we ever need to be able to get them from a wheelchair. And we have levers on the doors. And then we got a pandemic puppy who grew bigger than we thought he was going to be. And he actually can open doors. He's very smart. And so for the outer doors, we had to go back and switch the levers for doorknobs so that he can't get out into the hallway, because I think he's so brilliant that not only will he be able to go into the hallway, he'll get into the elevator, he'll take himself down to the first floor, and he'll take himself to the park. So just be careful before you outfit your entire place with levers. That's all I have to say.
Well, that I love that story, by the way, but it does tell us something else. And it's that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to all the homes. And I would never tell someone, put in every feature immediately right now. More to me, it's a list, again, of options. You've heard me say that word at least 10 times in this conversation. But the idea that you should know about and think about it and then say, well, does it meet my needs? In my home, I might have all of those. In your home, you might say for that outside door, because of dog issues, I might not. That might not work for me. And that's okay. My goal is to have people at least make thoughtful decisions and understand the trade-offs that they're making whenever they choose any of these features for the home. And by the way, one thing I'll mention, when you talk about remodeling your home, that putting that light switch at that reachable height cost you 0% more than it would have to put it at a higher height. Whichever door handle you chose is probably in the same price range as well. So just being thoughtful about these things doesn't necessarily need to cost you more money. It's just, it gives you that perspective of thinking ahead, which might help you out in the long run.
As we are thinking of these things to do, I know that you have a few things that you say not to do. You keep a do not do list. So clue us in on what's on that.
Yes, I think people like to think about the things to do often, and so the things not to do are also important. And I'd say the first thing for me on that do not do list was something I just mentioned. And it's, do not fail to think comprehensively. Don't just think about one piece of your home or one piece of the decision process. Think about it all. And we're complete people. And the example this often give is people who bought a home way outside of town to save money. Well, then when they saw gas prices shoot up to $5 and plus $6 a gallon, you're all of a sudden stuck, and maybe you can't even get to your job or to your family or whatever else you might need to get to. And so we should think about transportation costs and our housing costs at the same time. We're complete people, so we need to do that. The second thing is, do not fail to think about tomorrow. Don't fall into the trap of being the Peter Pan complex, as some disability advocates once called it. We do grow old, we do change, and lives change. And so the idea that things change for us should be inherent in this. And so, what might I need tomorrow? What might change about my family, my life? That's something that's crucial to think about. And as part of that, the fact that income shifts are part of that as well. If we're still working age, that might shift. Or in retirement, our income might drop a little bit. So, do we have what we need for that long run? And the final thing on the do not list, I say do not be one of those NIMBYs you mentioned earlier. Don't be closed off to new strategies or approaches. The idea that we might want to do something or need something that doesn't exist now, or that we might want to change in our community, we shouldn't be afraid of that change. We should understand how to shape that change so that it works for us and works for our neighbors and works for others. But you shouldn't be just opposed to change. And so the idea is that holistically, people should be thinking broader. And I think it's sometimes our nature to say, hey, we've got a lot of things to think about. I'm only going to focus on this one thing or this one piece. But my do not do list is largely around the idea of don't think too small. Think about the ways that you can really meet your holistic needs and use some of the tools we've talked about to make that easier for yourself. I don't want it to be overwhelming either.
Leave yourself options. I'm just gonna put a big sign on the wall that says options. Rodney, you mentioned a number of resources today that people can tap into. I'd love to just ask you to repeat them so that if anybody wasn't taking notes and wanted to sort of jot them down, where at AARP can they find things like the Livability Index and other tools?
Sure. The best single resource I can give you right now is aarp.org/livable. And that's our community, livable community homepage of things. And there you can get links to the AARP Home Fit Guide, which tells you about changes in your home. You'll get links to our Livability Index, which tells you about your neighborhood and how that works for you, and just many other resources about communities that could benefit not just you, but your community leaders and others as well.
And if you are looking for information to make sure that you can afford all of these changes that are coming down the pike, you can check out our website as well, protectedincome.org. And specifically for this conversation, protectedincome.org/Harrell. I'll put that up on the screen in a second. Rodney, it is always a pleasure. Thank you so much for bringing all of your ideas and your knowledge and your enthusiasm to this audience today. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And thanks everyone for those great questions and comments. Great being here.
Absolutely. All right. We'll see you next time. Bye, all.